आन में 1970 ALM Flight 980 a Douglas DC-9 departed John F. Kennedy International Airport bound for Princess Juliana International Airport in St. Martin. The flight, operated by Antlion Airlines but leased from Overseas National Airviews, was packed with eager vacationers and locals returning home. The crew, led by Captain Richard K. Simmons, anticipated a routine flight through the Caribbean, but the weather forecasts painted a troubling picture. As they cruised south, ominous storm systems swirled ahead, an unwelcome presence between them and their destination. Air traffic controllers warned of deteriorating conditions, but Flight 980 pressed on. Deviating slightly from their course in hopes of finding a gap in the storms, the pilots grew anxious as turbulence rattled the aircraft, and thick clouds swallowed them whole. Every second in the cockpit became a battle against uncertainty. The captain glanced at his instruments, his fingers gripping the yoke tighter as the aircraft shuddered. "We'll find a way through," he assured his crew, though the tension in his voice was unmistakable. The first officer, scanning the weather radar, shook his head. "We're running out of gaps, Captain. This storm is worse than reported." The navigator, tracking their position, noted the rapid change in wind speed and direction, his face pale with worry. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers chatted nervously, oblivious to the growing danger outside. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and small comforts, though their own anxiety was mounting. A few passengers peered out the windows, watching as lightning flickered through the clouds. Some sensed the turbulence was more aggressive than usual. A businessman adjusted his tie repeatedly, while a mother tightened her grip around her child's hand. In the galley, the lead flight attendant whispered to a colleague, "Something doesn't feel right." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone steady but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some turbulence due to weather conditions ahead. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. We will keep you updated." His words, though intended to reassure, did little to quell the unease creeping through the aircraft. As they pressed on, the turbulence worsened. The DC-9 rocked violently, prompting gasps from passengers. Drinks spilled, luggage compartments rattled, and a few overhead bins popped open, dropping bags into the aisles. A sharp jolt sent one passenger clutching the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. In the cockpit, the crew fought to maintain control. "Damn it, this is getting worse," the first officer exclaimed, his eyes locked on the altimeter. The aircraft was struggling to maintain altitude as wind shear slammed into them. "We need to decide now, Captain." Simmons hesitated, knowing that any decision he made could mean the difference between safety and disaster. "Let's try to climb above it," he finally ordered. The engines roared as the DC-9 strained to gain altitude, but the storm seemed to chase them, growing more ferocious by the second. A sudden downdraft sent them plunging several hundred feet in a heartbeat, eliciting screams from the passengers. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead, adding to the chaos. The crew exchanged grim glances. They were trapped in the storm, and their options were running out fast. As the aircraft neared St. Martin, the crew faced an impossible choice. The storm had intensified beyond expectations, making a safe landing nearly impossible. The captain weighed their options: attempt an approach in visibility or divert to an alternate airport. With fuel reserves dwindling, they turned to San Juan, Puerto Rico. But as they veered off course, their situation became dire. Strong headwinds increased fuel consumption, and the gauges painted a terrifying reality: they had far less fuel than anticipated. The first officer suggested turning back, but the captain dismissed the idea. A dangerous decision loomed: continue toward San Juan with no certainty of arrival or search for another place to put the aircraft down. Hope rested on their ability to stretch their resources to the absolute limit. The turbulence showed no mercy. The aircraft shook violently, forcing the pilots to tighten their grips on the controls. "We need options now," the first officer shouted over the roar of the storm outside. The radio crackled as air traffic control confirmed the worsening conditions. San Juan is reporting severe turbulence and strong crosswinds. The verting may not be possible. The captain clenched his jaw. Damn it! The stress in the cockpit was palpable. Every decision came with a risk, and every second lost narrowed their choices. The flight engineer tapped on the fuel gauge. "We're running out faster than expected," he said gravely. "We have to decide where to land, and soon." In the cabin, the passengers were becoming restless. Some clutched their armrests, others whispered hurried prayers. A baby wailed in the back row, adding to the growing tension. A flight attendant crouched beside a nervous elderly woman, holding her hand. "We're going to be okay," she reassured, though uncertainty gnawed at her own resolve. As the minutes passed, the pilots scrambled for solutions. The visibility outside was close to nothing, and lightning flashed relentlessly in the distance. The thought of attempting to land in these conditions felt more suicidal than strategic. "Captain, what about ditching?" the first officer asked hesitantly. Simmons hesitated. Ditching was a last resort, a move that came with almost no guarantees of survival. But the fuel was nearly gone, and the chances of making it to San Juan were looking slimmer by the second. "We don't have much choice left," he admitted. "Let's prepare for a water landing." The decision sent a wave of tension through the crew. The flight attendants were informed and quickly moved through the cabin, instructing passengers on emergency landing procedures. The passengers' reactions ranged from shock to outright panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are preparing for an emergency landing in the water. Please follow crew instructions carefully." The fear in his voice was barely concealed. The aircraft jolted as the engines sputtered. Fuel exhaustion was imminent. With no other option, Simmons committed to the most harrowing maneuver of his career. He turned his gaze to the horizon, praying for a miracle as they prepared to meet the unforgiving ocean below. Descending toward San Juan, the fuel situation turned critical. The engines, deprived of the lifeblood that kept them running, began to sputter. The cabin, once filled with the murmurs of anxious passengers, fell eerily silent as the aircraft's descent steepened. Van by van, the engines flamed out. Now Flight 980 was nothing more than a glidon, dropping fast over the open ocean. The crew issued a maydew, their voices betraying the fear creeping into their bones. With no power left, Captain Simmons had only seconds to act. The choppy waters of the Caribbean stretched out below, a rough and deadly alternative to a proper runway. Every second counted as he aligned the aircraft for an emergency ditching. The decision had been made, and the fate of all on board rested on a single maneuver. The first officer clenched his fists, his breath shallow as he assisted in guiding the aircraft. "Brace for impact," he shouted into the intercom. In the cabin, panic reached a fever pitch. Some passengers clung to their loved ones, others followed the flight attendants, shouted instructions, assuming crash positions. Tears streamed down faces, whispered prayers filled the air, and the realization that their survival hinged on the next few moments settled like a suffocating weight over everyone on board. The ocean loomed closer, its dark waves rolling with an eerie indifference. "Hold it steady," Simmons muttered to himself, his grip firm but fingers damp with sweat. The flight attendants shouted their final commands, strapping themselves into the nearest available seats. The aircraft hit the water with a brute force. The nose pitched forward as the fuselage slammed against the surface, sending a massive spray of seawater into the sky. The impact jolted everyone violently, seats ripped from their anchors, and the sound of tearing metal filled the air. Screams echoed through the cabin, followed by an eerie silence as the aircraft shuddered to a halt. In the relentless sea, water rushed in through the shattered fuselage. "Get the exits open," a flight attendant cried, wading through the rising water. The crew worked frantically, deploying life rafts and urging passengers toward the exits. The once orderly evacuation procedures dissolved into chaos as panicked passengers pushed their way forward. Some struggled with their life vests, their hands shaking too much to secure them properly. Others scrambled toward the emergency exits, eyes wide with shock. Outside, the rafts bobbed in the tumultuous waves, some passengers already pulling themselves aboard, helping others climb to safety. The sun, which had been obscured by storm clouds, cast a dim glow over the wreckage. A few passengers floated in the water, gripping debris as they fought against the pull of the currents. In the cockpit, the crew made their final checks before abandoning the aircraft. Captain Simmons, the last to leave, took one last look at the shattered remains of Flight 980 before plunging into the water. He kicked toward the nearest raft, lungs burning from the salty air, his mind racing with the weight of what had just transpired. Time stretched endlessly for the survivors. The distant hum of approaching aircraft and the sight of Coast Guard vessels on the horizon sparked a glimmer of hope. The rescue efforts were swift, but for those clinging to life in the open water, every second felt like an eternity. By the time the last survivor was pulled aboard a rescue vessel, the reality of what had happened set in. 40 people had survived. The rest, lost to the sea, became part of a tragic chapter in aviation history. ALM Flight 980 had met its end, not on a runway, but in the unforgiving depths of the ocean. The DC-9 struck the ocean's surface with a violent force, shattering the aircraft's structure. Water surged in instantly, sending passengers into panic as they fought to escape. The impact had been survivable, but the battle was far from over. Life vests and rafts were deployed as the fuselage began to sink beneath the waves. The tropical sun, which had been obscured by storms, now shone down on a desperate scene, passengers clinging to wreckage, the crew attempting to maintain order amidst chaos. The smell of fuel spread across the water, a reminder of how close they had come to an explosion upon impact. The survivors, battered and exhausted, struggled to stay afloat in the rough sea. Some had managed to get into the rafts, their hands shaking as they gripped the edges, staring at the remains of the aircraft floating nearby. Others, injured and weak, clung desperately to debris, their voices hoarse from calling out for help. Captain Simmons, chest heaving from exertion, pulled himself onto a raft and immediately began counting heads. He knew the rescue efforts would be swift, but in this vast expanse of water, every minute counted. He scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of approaching aircraft or ships. The flight attendants, trained for emergencies but never truly prepared for a scene like this, moved from raft to raft, ensuring passengers were secure and as calm as they could be in such a horrific situation. One attendant gripped a terrified woman's hand, whispering words of reassurance even as her own hands trembled. "They'll find us soon," she murmured. "Just hold on." The ocean, vast and indifferent, seemed to stretch endlessly around them. The waves swelled and crashed unpredictably, sending cold sprays of salt water over the survivors. A man, his face streaked with blood from a head wound, groaned in pain as another passenger tried to keep him upright. "Help will come," the passenger assured, though doubt flickered in his eyes. Hours passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. A few survivors sobbed quietly, their energy drained from the trauma. Others sat in stunned silence, their minds replaying the nightmare over and over again. Some kept their eyes fixed on the sky, desperate for the sight of a rescue plane. Then a distant hum cut through the sound of the waves. Heads snapped upward as a search aircraft appeared, its shadow casting a hopeful streak across the water. A flare was fired from one of the rafts, a bright signal against the endless blue. The plane circled, confirming their location. Relief swept through the survivors. Help was finally coming. The first rescue boats arrived soon after, cutting through the waves with precision. Coast Guard personnel pulled survivors aboard, wrapping them in blankets and checking for injuries. Tears mixed with seawater on many faces, gratitude overwhelming the exhaustion. Some could barely speak as they were lifted from the water, their bodies shaking from shock. Captain Simmons, the last to be rescued, collapsed onto the deck of the vessel, his mind spinning. The weight of the disaster settled heavily on his shoulders. 40 people had survived. The rest were gone, swallowed by the sea. The realization left an ache deeper than any wound. As the survivors were taken to shore, the wreckage of ALM Flight 980 drifted further into history, a ghostly reminder of a desperate crew and the awful decisions they had been forced to make. The tragedy would be analyzed for years, lessons drawn from every misstep. But for those who had lived through it, the memory would never fade. The cries, the chaos, the fight for survival, it would haunt them forever, a stark reminder of how fate and human choices can intertwine in the most unforgiving of circumstances.